The Afro-Frontier and David Weber's concept of the Spanish borderlands intersect in several significant ways, primarily concerning the experiences and roles of people of African descent within these contested and dynamic regions of North America. Here's a breakdown of the key points of intersection. 1. Presence and agency of African descendants. Spanish borderlands. David Weber's work on the Spanish borderlands highlights that people of African descent, both enslaved and free, were present throughout these regions, from Florida to California, from the earliest periods of Spanish colonization. They were not merely passive figures, but actively participated in the social, economic, and sometimes even political life of the borderlands. Afro-Frontier. The concept of the Afro-Frontier, particularly as exemplified by communities like Blackdom, New Mexico, emphasizes the agency of African Americans in actively seeking out and creating spaces for self-determination and opportunity on the western frontier of the United States. This often occurred in areas that were once part of the Spanish borderlands. 2. Borderland dynamics and social mobility. Spanish borderlands. Weber's research points out that the fluid and often less rigidly controlled nature of the Spanish borderlands, compared to the colonial centers, sometimes allowed for greater social mobility for people of African descent. The need for settlers, soldiers, and skilled labor provided opportunities that were often denied in more hierarchical societies. Afro-Frontier. The Afro-Frontier experience, particularly in the post-Civil War era, also involved navigating complex social and political landscapes. While seeking to escape racial oppression in the East and South, African Americans on the frontier often encountered existing social structures, including those influenced by the legacy of Spanish colonial interactions with indigenous populations and the development of unique borderland cultures. 3. Historical trajectory and overlapping spaces. Spanish borderlands as precursor. The Spanish borderlands represent an earlier phase of frontier development in many of the regions that later became part of the American West and the Afro-Frontier. The institutions, cultural exchanges, and demographic shifts that occurred during the Spanish colonial period laid the groundwork for subsequent developments. Convergence in the 19th century. As the United States expanded westward, the Afro-Frontier emerged in territories that were once part of the Spanish borderlands, e.g., New Mexico, Texas, California. The interactions between Anglo-American settlers, Mexican populations, indigenous peoples, and African Americans in these overlapping spaces created unique social dynamics. For example, African-American Buffalo Soldiers played a role in the U.S. military presence in these former Spanish territories. 4. Seeking autonomy and escaping oppression. Spanish borderlands. While not always the primary motivation, the Spanish borderlands could offer refuge for enslaved Africans seeking to escape English or later American territories. The different legal and social systems, as well as the presence of indigenous communities, provided avenues for freedom. Afro-Frontier. A central tenet of the Afro-Frontier is the deliberate effort by African Americans to create communities and lives free from the intense racial discrimination and violence they faced in other parts of the United States. This drive for autonomy often led them to frontier regions, including those with a Spanish colonial past. 5. Intersections with indigenous populations. Spanish borderlands. Weber's work emphasizes the complex relationships between the Spanish, indigenous peoples, and people of African descent in the borderlands. These interactions ranged from conflict and exploitation to alliances and cultural exchange. Afro-Frontier. Similarly, African American communities on the Afro-Frontier often interacted with indigenous populations, sometimes as allies, sometimes in competition for resources, and sometimes within the context of the U.S. government's policies towards both groups. In essence, the Afro-Frontier can be seen as a later chapter in the history of many regions that were once part of the Spanish borderlands. While Weber focuses on the Spanish colonial era and its immediate aftermath, the concept of the Afro-Frontier highlights the experiences and agency of African Americans in these same geographical areas as the United States expanded and developed its own western frontier. Both perspectives underscore the complex interplay of cultures, power dynamics, and the diverse populations that shape these dynamic regions of North America.